We'll get underway again. So our next speaker is Marie Zitny. Marie is the Director of Review in Integrity Services, and Marie will give an overview on when an agency should engage an external investigator, including some experiences and some tips from the CCC. So thanks, Marie.
Thank you, Jeff. Good morning, everyone. As Jeff said, my name is Marie Zitny and I'm the Director of the Review Unit in Integrity Services. So the Review Unit is responsible for the CCC's monitoring function. So we deal with those devolved investigations that have been sent back to agencies under review, public interest reviews and merit and compliance reviews. So as Jeff said, the topic today is when should an agency engage an external investigator? So most of you are likely all too aware of the complexities of managing workplace investigations. There can be a lot of pressure and sometimes confusion regarding how they should be dealt with. One of the difficulties is determining whether it is a matter that can't be dealt with internally and an external investigator should be appointed. Today's presentation provides some guidance on the types of circumstances where it is appropriate to engage an external investigator, specifically in relation to complaints of corrupt conduct. Now, there is a Public Service Commission directive issued late last year, 17 of 20, that outlines the principles for undertaking a workplace investigation and when an external investigator should be engaged. Now, that directive does not apply to the management of corrupt conduct complaints, but in any event, the content of the directive is not at odds with the advice I'm providing today. So, quick overview of the presentation. I'm going to speak about CCC processes, particularly in relation to matters that are devolved back to public sector agencies for investigation. I'll discuss the reasons for engaging an external investigator and some considerations when doing so. I'll also be discussing a couple of cases that have been reviewed by the CCC where external investigators were involved. And I'll be sharing some tips and experiences from some of our reviews of devolved investigations. So, CCC assessment decisions. Now, if you're from one of the smaller government departments or councils, then you may not deal with the CCC very often, but you would be aware of your obligation to report corrupt conduct to the CCC if there is a reasonable suspicion. Very briefly, once a matter is reported to the CCC, there's an assessment process where if it's assessed as a reasonable suspicion of corrupt conduct, a decision-making then takes place within the CCC, which results in one of these outcomes that you see on the screen. The majority of matters are referred back to agencies to deal with under the devolution principle, either with no further advice required by the CCC, or in some cases, they're referred back and monitored by our review unit to ensure they're dealt with appropriately. Now, the review unit monitors around about 7% of matters that are referred back to agencies, and that's by public interest review or merit and compliance review, with strict reporting timeframes for those matters. Depending on the circumstances, an external investigator may be an appropriate choice to investigate a matter that has been returned to an agency for investigation, and that's whether it's under review by the CCC or not. Of course, I'm only talking about corrupt conduct matters today, but there may be other types of complaints that would also warrant engaging an external investigator, depending on the nature of the complaint and the circumstances. Now, when the CCC refers a matter to an agency to deal with, a matters assessed report is sent in which we provide the details of who made the complaint, if the complainant has consented, unless they're anonymous, or if the CCC has identified a risk in disclosing that information. If known, the identity of the subject, some reporting timeframes, if that's applicable. So that's for those matters that are being reviewed by the CCC. The source material, and any other relevant information that the CCC is able to disclose to assist in the investigation of the complaint. The Matters Assessed Report, or MAR as we call it, will also include any directions about how the complaint should be dealt with. Now, on some occasions, the CCC will provide a recommendation, sometimes a strong recommendation, that an external investigator should be engaged. So if you were going down the pathway of engaging an investigator, an external investigator, there are some considerations that you will need to make. Importantly, when engaging an external investigator, the public official must always comply with all relevant procurement obligations, of course. You don't want to end up with an investigation into the selection of the external investigator. When selecting an external investigator, the CCC is unable to provide you with any preferences. And unfortunately, there's no foolproof formula for selecting an external investigator. You could seek recommendations from other liaison officers and from the Public Service Commission. For local government, the Office of the Independent Assessor has recently identified a panel of external investigators from the whole of government preferred suppliers list based on affordability and experience in the local government context, and I understand they've provided that panel to council CEOs to assist them. It's important you seek experienced and suitably qualified investigators. You should particularly look for expertise in the type of matter that is going to be under investigation, and always avoid an external investigator with any connection to the parties involved, be that past work or social engagement. And this may prevent further issues down the track. Also be aware that an external investigator's related legal practice should not be engaged to advise or act for the agency in any actual or contemplated proceedings related to an investigation. So reasons for engaging an external investigator. There are a few. It's essential to maintain the integrity of an investigation and ensure that it withstands the public scrutiny test. The risk to public confidence in the investigation is a major reason for engaging an external investigator. External investigations are very expensive, so they should not be outsourced without good reason. It's always preferable for an investigation to be conducted internally if possible, but sometimes the best choice, or the only choice, is to outsource. For example, if the allegations are against the public official, then it would be appropriate to engage an external investigator. It's going to be very difficult for an internal investigator to objectively undertake an investigation against the most senior person in an agency. There could also be other situations where there is a clear power imbalance between the investigator and the subject officer, so that may be cause for engaging an external investigator. Allegations against the CCC's liaison officer or against the agency investigators would be another reason where it would be certainly prudent to engage an external investigator. That's to ensure objectivity. Some other circumstances could include the resourcing capability and capacity of an agency. If you don't have suitably qualified investigators, or there is no capacity to undertake an investigation, then if it's a potentially serious matter, it may be prudent to engage externally. A lack of experience in corrupt conduct investigations may cause further issues, particularly if there are errors in the investigation. If there's a potential for criminal charges, it's important that a qualified investigator is used, as they must have an understanding of the rules of evidence, preserving evidence, etc. A lack of capacity could be a reason to outsource. You may have qualified internal investigators, but the agency could be so overwhelmed with investigations they need to engage external investigators to get back on track. And that's obviously a matter for the agency to determine. If it's a matter that requires specialist skills, for example IT or auditing skills, then you may need to consider hiring a specialised investigator to deal with this type of case. And if you have a particularly high-profile matter where there has been or is likely to be a lot of media interest, that could lead you to consider engaging an external investigator to ensure the investigation is independent and objective. And again, that would really depend on the circumstances of that case. So I've got a couple of cases to discuss with you of matters that where external investigators have been involved, and we've reviewed them. In this first case, the allegations... Oh, I just changed that, sorry. Case study number 1. In this first case, the allegations were referred to the CCC by a public sector agency and assessed as suspected corrupt conduct. The matter was referred back to the agency for investigation, subject to a public interest review. Initially, we did not recommend an external investigator be appointed. However, during our review, it became clear that there was a power imbalance between the agency investigator and the subject officer, who was in a very senior role. We identified that the subject officer was very hostile in their communications with the internal investigator, and we formed the view that it was likely that the investigator was being intimidated. The internal investigator provided a report at the end of their investigator, but that came to the CCC for review, and it recommended that the matter be finalised with no further action. We reviewed that report and did not accept that no further action finding, and recommended an external investigator be appointed on the basis of the power imbalance and that there was likely to be more evidence available to support the allegations that had not been obtained. The public official of that agency agreed with the CCC recommendation and engaged an external investigator. And as a result, the external investigation was able to substantiate many of the allegations against the subject officer, and the matter was also referred to the Queensland Police Service for investigation. The subject officer resigned before the completion of the investigation, and post-separation discipline is being pursued. The second case here, case number 2. Now, in this matter, several employees of a council made complaints, numerous complaints to the CCC against staff within the governance unit of a council, including complaints against the CCC's liaison officer. In this case, we referred the matter back to the council for investigation, subject to a public interest review, with a strong recommendation for external investigation. The council subsequently appointed an external investigator to deal with the matter. In this case, it was not possible to delegate the investigative function to another employee or business unit within the agency, as there was no staff with investigative experience, and in any event, it would have been really difficult for them to ensure objectivity. Considering the roles of the staff who were subject officers in this case, the only real option available was to outsource the investigation to maintain the quality, integrity and confidentiality of the investigation and its outcomes. And that was successfully done in this case. So here's just a few tips from our reviews of external investigations that may assist you in choosing external investigators. A good investigation report should be well structured, concise and easy to read. And there's an example of our preferred report structure available in the Corruption in Focus handbook on our website. An executive summary providing a succinct précis of the investigation should always be included, but surprisingly it isn't. Attachments should be numbered and referred to correctly throughout the report. Again, that's not always the case, and that makes the report quite difficult to read. All relevant witnesses should have been contacted and interviewed if possible. And when witnesses aren't interviewed, it's really important to outline that attempts have been made, or if they haven't, the reasons why. There should be clear analysis of the evidence that supports the findings. That's essential. And systemic issues should be identified, preferably with appropriate recommendations to address these issues. Although an allegation may be unsubstantiated, there may be internal policies and procedures which need to be improved, or training or some other suitable measure that could be implemented to prevent the same allegations occurring in the future. Some reports that are undertaken by external investigators that we've reviewed have been excellent. High quality, objective, clear and concise, but unfortunately there have been others that have been poor quality and unnecessarily lengthy, which is quite costly, obviously, and they haven't addressed the actual allegations. Here's a few more tips from our experiences. If a matter is being reviewed, the CCC's liaison officer or the person managing the investigation should try and maintain communication with the CCC's review officer. It's important to establish a relationship between the review officer during the process, and it's beneficial for both agencies. The Matters Assessed report that we send out contains the name and contact details of the review officer for a matter that's being reviewed. We don't generally deal with external investigators directly, but on occasion there may be a need to do that, and that would be an exception rather than rule, as generally it's the liaison officer, the CCC's liaison officer, who deals with the external agency, and they're managing the investigation. But certainly there has been times where we've had direct contact with external investigators. Interim reports provided to the CCC need to be sufficiently detailed regarding the progress of the investigation, so that can enable us to decide whether our level of involvement requires adjusting. During the course of the investigation, if there are changes, such as additional subject officers, or the allegations are more serious than originally assessed, please notify the CCC, as this could impact on the way it's dealt with, and we may need to assume responsibility, or alternatively, it may be something that no longer requires review. Importantly, when managing an external investigation, it's essential to keep a close eye on what the external investigators are doing. You need to ensure they're keeping to scope and that they're progressing appropriately within time frame. Lastly, feel free to contact Integrity Services for advice on when to engage an external investigator if you are unsure. Just mention Corruption in Focus again, the guide. I'm sure you've heard about it a couple of times today, but it is really a useful guide for dealing with corrupt conduct in the public sector on our website. It's useful for investigators and also for managing investigations. And that's it from me.